things only seem impossible when we don't understand the mechanics behind them. On the 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers performed their famous first flight of a powered aircraft in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. It was amazing time, but it's in the years leading up to the Wright brothers' first flight of a plane. There was a lot of doubt among many scientists, engineers, those types of people who were interested in the invention of what plane. There was a growing consensus that was impossible. That airplane and the way it was modeled would simply not work. In fact, I have a couple great quotes of people who said just that. Joseph LeConte in November 1888 said this: "It is that a true flight, self-raising, self-sustaining, self-propelling, is physically impossible," with the implied answer being, yeah, it's impossible. Can't be done happen. Thomas Edison, who's known for his work in electricity and the light bulb, and especially commercializing some of those things, said this in 18... "It is apparent to me that the possibilities of an aeroplane 2 or 3 years ago were thought to hold the solution to the flying machine problem have been exhausted. We must turn elsewhere." In 1907, Lord Haldane, a high-ranking British official, said this: "The aeroplane will never fly." And you may say, wait a second, he said that in 1907? Wasn't their first flight way back in 1903? Didn't they have photos of it by then? Yes, but Lord Haldane, or whatever his name is, still didn't believe it. He was like, fake news, can't happen, the airplane's never going to work. And the Wright brothers were like, and the reason why it's hard for many of these people to grasp that, yes, airplane with its wings, fixed wings, and powered flight was not only possible, it was hard for them to understand because they didn't understand yet the mechanics of it. They didn't understand, aerodynamics and high and low pressure and lift that the wings could create to allow a plane to fly. They just didn't understand the mechanics. And because of that, they considered it impossible and wrote it off. I bring that up this morning because we understand the mechanics of the way our world works. Have some idea, a vague idea of the physics of the world that God has set. But we know that there is a God who is almighty, all powerful, the creator of it all, and he can do whatever he wants, whether it's physically possible, the way the laws of physics are set up, or not. God can do it. And yet, many times, I think we sound like some of these doubters of the airplane. Forget who is behind the operation of our world. We forget what God in our lives. We forget the mechanics of it and face something that seems impossible by every human intellect, but is possible for God. We either trust in those mechanics or we kind of fall into doubt and say, is this something that can really happen, or is it just impossible? I'm going to say impossible a lot. And I understand that everything is possible for God. But when I use the word impossible this morning, it's going to kind of be from our perspective, from the human perspective. Because we want to talk about how to impossible. And we're going to see that in Joshua chapter 6, so you could open up there. We are back into our series called Forward in the book of Joshua, and we're going to finally finish it up now. I know Dave Parsons joked last week and said, Shane's kind of working through Joshua willy-nilly. Poor Dave. I heard about that one. He didn't mean it that way. Kind of know, start chapter 6 and kind of go through the end as we approach June. As you're opening up there, let me kind of remind us of what we were talking about the last time we were in the book of Joshua. Actually, let's kind of like lead up to this part of the story so we could get reacquainted. Remember that the story of Joshua really starts all the way back in the book of Exodus, where God uses Moses to free his people Israel from Egypt, and he does it in a miraculous way, and he guides them through the wilderness towards a land that he had promised them. On the way, teaching them who he was, how they should relate to them, who they be as God's people. But when they get to the promised land, they look inside and they see powerful nations that would love to wipe them off the map. They say, there's no way we can do this. We can't go to the land. And many of the people rebelled. They sent in 12 spies. 2 of them brought back a good report. One of them did away. But the other did. And after that rebellion, God said, all right, well then you are not ready to enter the land. He says, this generation is going to pass. You're going to wait 40 years to enter the land. And then I will have trained you to trust to do things my way. And so by the time we get to the book of Joshua, Moses is passed on, that generation is passed on, and now Joshua and this new generation are ready to follow God into this land that he had promised them. And God does nothing but encourage the people of Israel through the first 6 chapters. In chapter 1, he tells Joshua, be strong, courageous, I'm with you, and I will never forsake you. An important reminder for us as believers, Jesus Christ. In chapter 2, they send in some more spies, just 2 this time. Way better idea, I think. Anyway, but they send in the 2 spies. The spies are almost captured. But a very unlikely woman, Rahab the prostitute, hides them, rescues them, and sends them back. Turn this report that the people in this land have seen what God has doing with Israel, and they're afraid of Israel coming in to take this land. So they're encouraged. In chapters 3 and 4, God stops the Jordan River from flowing in a similar way to the part of the Red Sea. And the people cross the flooding Jordan River on dry land. And God telling his people, if I can stop the Jordan River, I can help you take this land that I've promised you and that I've been promising your people for generations. In chapter 5, God continues to encourage his people. He renews his covenant with Israel. Israel practices the Passover to remind them of God has delivered them in the past. God stops the manna, what they've been eating all these years, from forming on the ground in the morning. And now they're going to eat off the land that God has promised them. And at the very end of chapter 5, he encouraged them one more time by sending them a messenger, an angel. And actually, let me start reading right there, because that leads us right into our passage in chapter 6 for today. Verse 13 of chapter 5 says this, when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was standing before him. And his drawn sword, Joshua went to him and said, are you for us or for our adversaries? And he said, no, but I am the commander of the Lord's army. Now I have come. And the implication there is, Joshua, it's not if God's on your side or on your enemy's side. The question, Joshua, is whose side are you on? Whose side are the Israelites on? That's the question we asked ourselves just Easter. Whose side are we on? God's side? Or are we trying to ask God to kind of join our side? I would rather be on God's side and follow where he is going than me trying to map the way and hope God comes along. That's not how it works. And then this angel tells them exactly how they can be inside as go and approach the mighty city, Jericho. Chapter 6, verse 1. Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in. The Lord said to Joshua, see Jericho into your hand, with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war going around the city once. Thus shall you do for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns on the 7th day shall march around the city 7 times, the trumpets. And when they make a long blast of the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the wall of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, everyone straight before him. I don't know about you, but that's one of the strangest battle plans I have ever heard, especially in light of what the Israelites are facing. So before we go any further and see how this battle plan is building, not just in Joshua, but all the way since back in Numbers 13 when the Israelites to the border of the promised land, is that sometimes God asks us to face the impossible. that sometimes God asks us to face the impossible. And make no mistake, what God is asking the people to do, to take this city, is impossible by every human measure. These people have been wandering around the desert 40 years. How good do you think their weapons are? I mean, sure, they probably have a couple swords, probably built a couple spears, maybe even fancy shields, but they don't have siege weapons. They don't have the kind of weapons of war you would need to take a big city like Jericho with strong walls. It said here right at the beginning of chapter 6, and Jericho was shut up inside and outside. It is locked down. And I was talking to someone this week about Jericho, and they're saying, listen, this is ancient times. How good were these walls really, though? And let me tell you, one of the first things humans got good at building was walls. And the reason why cities were so important in those days, it was very hard to take a city with strong walls without the kind of weapons and time and resources it would take for a long and arduous siege. And that's what's taken. But the Israelites don't have the weapons, probably don't have the personnel. I don't know how well these soldiers have been trained while wandering the desert all those years. And they're no longer eating manna every morning. They can't last out there forever waiting the city to weaken and starve. They're going to have to eat off the land, and they don't have the kind of protection to produce that amount of food for them. We accept the fact that from every human perspective, this battle that God is asking Israel to face is impossible. And the truth is, God asks us to face the impossible all the time. I don't know what it looks like for you. Maybe it is for, how could I possibly get it? I don't know if I'm going to be able to get into this position. Maybe it's financial, like I don't know how we're going to make it to the next paycheck. The numbers simply aren't adding up. Maybe there is a relationship that has been severed and broken, and you are longing for God to fix it, but there's no way that person is going to change their mind with you. It seems impossible that this relationship can be fixed. Or maybe it's some diagnosis that you receive, and you're asking God, how am I going to get through this? And you know what, that lasts with many things. Sometimes when God asks us to face the impossible, it's not just overcoming a battle. It's not just conquering something. It's not just getting the job or making it to the next paycheck. Sometimes it's like a survive of our heart or survive of our mind. Lord, how am I actually going to endure or make it through this time? It seems impossible to me. A lot of people who have been experiencing that over the last year, who are tired of everything that we are going through over the last year in our community and our around, saying, Lord, how much longer are we going to be able to make it? It seems impossible. I'm tired. I talked to a friend this week who felt like he had faced the impossible recently. My friend Jeff, who's a pastor he's a family's pastor down in Texas. I met him when I was living down there. A minor surgery, fixed a little problem, no big deal. But a week later, he wasn't feeling good, and his fever got so bad they took him to the hospital. It turned out his toe was infected. Not just infected, the bone itself got infected as well. And so suddenly my friend finds himself now in the hospital for a full week, and they're debating, like, do we take off the toe? Do we have to take the whole foot? Is the infection spreading, or we get the leg? And that is what my mind is wondering every day. And he's asking himself, Lord, how am I going to endure this? Seems impossible. And now he is on the other side of great faith. So it's never like he, doubted or thought that God wouldn't come through and allow him to endure whatever the results were, because he had to come to a place where he was saying, I have to be okay with however this turns out. Now, thankfully, it looks like he's going to be able to keep everything, even the toe, which he was willing to let go at some point. It felt like it was impossible. And we as a people just need to be ready and used to this, that we're gonna face things from time to time that seem like that there's no earthly way they're going to resolve either the way we desire, or even that our minds and our hearts are going to remain intact to endure it through the process. State of the world that we are living in today, and we shouldn't be surprised when God sends us into places that seems like we have an impossible barrier before us. So sometimes God asks us to face the impossible. We ask, well, how is God going to get me through this? And I look at the book of Joshua. I see this battle plan. I'm like, this is it? This is your great solution, Lord, to taking the land of, you're going to march around the, okay, are you hoping to scare them that they're going to run out of the city? Like, how is this supposed to work? And so let's continue to read. Will Israel do things the way God has instructed them? Or are they going to have a more earthly plan to get things here? Verse 6. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord. Right? He's following God's instructions. And he said to the people, go forward and march around the city and let the armed one pass on of the Lord. Here's why the ark, a long time, when we talked about in chapter, remember that the ark is the symbol of God's presence. Actually, it's more than a symbol. It is God's presence with his people. That is where he rests. That is where he's meeting with Moses. When they are going around is the reminder to Israel of God's covenant with them, and that his presence is right there with them. Verse 8. And just as Joshua was commanded, the people and the 7 priests bearing the trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. And the armed men were walking before the priests who were blowing the trumpets, and the rear guard was walking after the ark where the trumpets blew continually. But Joshua commanded the people, you shall not shout or make your voice heard, neither any word go out of your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout. So he caused the ark of the Lord to circle the city, going about it once. And they came into the camp, spent the night in the camp. Joshua arose in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord walked on, and they blew the trumpets continually. And the armed men were walking before them, and the rear guard was walking after the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets blew continually. And the second day they marched around the city once, turned into, so they did for 6 days. And you're like, oh, Shane, this narrative's starting to drag. Woo! Are they going to go through each day here on how they're going around the city and the trumpets and the reason we're getting so much detail here is because the author, who is powered by the Holy Spirit to write this, wants to show Israel is following the directions exactly. We as humans generally, and Israel specifically, had a lot of trouble following God's directions exactly. And so the reason why it's repeating this over and over and over again, and the reason why to our modern ears it might be sounding monotonous, is to show us they are following the plan exactly, as crazy as it sounds. Let's keep on reading. Verse 15, and on the 7th day, they rose at the dawn of the day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city times. And at the 7th time, when the priests had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And the city and all that in it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. And so he commands them to shout, and we would expect, reading the story, we hear Israel shout, and then again the narrator interrupts the story to tell us some very important information. And that's why this is interrupting the story for us. He says that it is to be devoted for destruction, a prostitute, and all who live, because she hid the messengers whom we sent. But you keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest when you have devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it. But all silver and gold, every vessel of bronze and iron, holy to the Lord, they shall go into the treasury of the Lord. So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. The people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him. That's the exact same language, the exact word had used, or that used to explain Joshua how to take the city at the beginning of the chapter. And then they devoted all the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, donkeys, with the edge of the sword. That's what we're seeing here. To approach life's challenges God's way, he does the impossible for us. That when you approach life's challenges God's way, he does the impossible for us. I've already joked about it 6 times, but let me say it one more time. This battle plan is ridiculous, right? No one goes and to siege a city like this. This thing doesn't happen. And some people try to scientific ways that God may have done these things, that when they shouted, the sound waves knocked down the wall. And ancient people knew how to build walls. We don't, and that's fine that people want to try to find these interesting kind of sciences in it, but we don't hand it. It's American natural. That's simply how God works sometimes, and that is how he worked. In this case, God did the impossible, and he did it when his people followed his command. No matter how unusual it sounded in the day in which they lived, and no matter how unusual it sounded based on every earthly logic and how you make a city. Listen, God is going to ask us to do things differently than make sense to us often. He's going to ask us to do things differently around us would do things. Let me give you, for example, tithing seems crazy to the world around us. Years ago when I was in seminary and becoming a pastor, I went home and visited some people, and I was hanging out with some old family friends, and they were just surprised because I'd grown up in the church that here I was becoming a pastor. And the biggest leap for them, the biggest thing that surprised them about me becoming a Christian, is he said, all right, Shane, tell me the truth. Do some Christians really give 10% to the church? And I was like, yeah, that's part of maturing as a barrier for him. He couldn't believe that. Forget the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, or what Christ did on the cross, or Jesus walking on water. That wasn't his question, was giving 10%? Crazy. Who would do such a thing? God asks us to do things that the world thinks are crazy. We'll take fasting, for example, more popular recently in world culture because they found out there may be some health benefits associated with occasionally fasting. But last Friday, we did our day of fasting and prayer, our Fast Friday that we've been doing every third Friday. Gain something spiritually by letting something go, by not feeding ourselves, by pouring out ourselves instead, by giving up food. Sounds crazy to the world around us. So it's you're having an spiritual experience by just being hungry all day? Right? That's how the logic would operate, right? So you're going to be hungry all day, and that somehow is going to grow your relationship with God. Okay, but it is. Not that fasting is always easy for us, but that's what God has called us to do. And many of you who I've talked to who have been doing this Fast Friday with us, some of you fasting for the first time have begun to see that day is important, that day is cool. I really see how I'm devoting myself to the Lord in that way. And we see the benefit from it. In the way that we as Christians respond in prayer. That our first action, crisis hits, when problems are away, is to just go and pray. And people increasingly are pushing back on this, saying, I don't want to hear about your prayers. I want you to go and do something about it. It's right, you want me to go do something about it? I'm going to first get some advice on what I should be doing. I'm going to go to prayer. I'm going to be praying for you. I'm going to be praying, asking God what I can do to help. On and on. God has called us to do as his people. And how when we face an impossible task, or a task that seems impossible to our eyes, God's going to often ask us to take an approach that is different than the world around us, that is different than what we would first think. But there's a reason he's doing this. There's a reason he's doing this. When we're back at the book of Joshua, who gets credit for this battle? Listen, no offense to the ladies who played that song earlier today. Joshua fought the battle of Jericho. Joshua didn't really fight the battle of Jericho. I mean, they went in and did some cleanup work after the walls fell. But by then, it was chaos. Actually, I'm really glad to play that song. No offense. I had a time. I was going to make fun of it. The Israelites didn't do any of the normal things you would do to take a city. The walls simply fell when the trumpets blew. And God gets the glory. Not only that, but when God asks us to do something that's unusual or even strange to us or the pattern of this world around us, it builds trust. As I said, we and Israel sometimes have a hard time following God's directions. I mean, all of the Bible is a testimony to human failure and our need for Jesus Christ to help us where we failed. But when it's in this unusual way, something that goes beyond our logic, and we trust Him, act that out, it builds trust in the Lord. So not only is glory for the outcome, but also our faith is growing as well. These moments of facing the impossible turn out to be moments of giant spiritual growth if we will do things the way God has asked to do them. And He can do the impossible. He is the Almighty Creator of heaven and earth. We don't want to forget that. Our God is not like all mythology that have limits. Our God is outside of time and space. He's the one that created it. And so He can do anything that He wants to. And so as we face life challenges, as we face the seemingly impossible, whether He's going to do what we ask Him or maybe He's not, and sometimes better that He does not, He can do the impossible. I was just talking to our children's ministry, new children's ministry director, Amelia, the other day. Many of you have met Amelia at this point. And Amelia was thinking back, and she's like, Shane, I'm not one to call everything a miracle or everything impossible. She doesn't want to jump too quickly sometimes to call something just this amazing spiritual thing that God has done. But she says, I didn't even imagine that this is where I would be a month and a half ago. That she has a job that she can grow into over the coming years, doing what she has longed to do for years and has been training for years and years to do. I'll be engaged to David. That David has a job offer in our area, which is awesome. May help them stick around for a long, long time. And that she's going to be married this summer. And how did all these things come together? I couldn't have even imagined it or assembled it ahead of time. That's how God works sometimes. Pathways that He leads us. If we follow Him. The Israelites experience here. God leading them through what seemed to be impossible. Now I have to pause for a minute and make a quick note, because this story may be troubling to some of us. It may raise some questions in our mind, and unbelievers alike. Why would God resort to conquest? And I've heard this accusation before. Isn't God advocating genocide here? Where's your God of love and mercy, grace in this story? And so I don't want this to dominate the message here, because it's not the message of the text, but we do have to wrestle with this. The fact that in verse 21 he says, then they devoted all in the city to destruction, both women, young and oxen, sheep, donkeys, with the edge of the sword. It's troubling. It should trouble us. While I'm not going to attempt to defend God, who knows as the Almighty Creator of heaven and earth, I do want to address this and share a couple important facts for understanding what God is doing here. First of all, there's no way that the current residents of the land would simply allow Israel to move in. In fact, on the way to the land, weren't even allowed to pass through some territories. In Numbers chapter 21, there were two places called Og, Sihon, and there were kings who existed there. And Israel were like, hey, listen, we're going to stay on the road. We just want to pass through with all our people. We don't want your land. We don't want to bother you. We're just going to kind of come over here. Please let us pass. And they were like no. In Numbers 21, they went and attacked Israel to wipe them out. And the Lord delivered, not that they were seeking to go and take those cities, but because they wouldn't pass through their territory. They're going to let Israel pass through. There's no reason Jericho or anywhere else would allow Israel to survive. You may debate whether the preemptive strike here is good or bad if you want, but anywhere, if the Lord had not delivered something into their hand. But the Jerichos and the cultures in these areas were evil. And not just evil from a Christian worldview, one of the most societies by almost any worldview in almost any time. The religious practices included child sacrifice, it tells us in Deuteronomy chapter 12. And that they were complete worship, Leviticus 18. And God told Israel way back in Deuteronomy 20 that these would have to be removed, that these kind of practices would have to be stopped. And he didn't want Israel to be involved in these kinds of evil religious, but he wanted the rest of this kind of thing to spread to the rest of the world. May seem like conquest here, but is bringing justice to great evil that was being done in these cities. These religious cultures, these evil practices had to be stopped. And if God had let this go on forever, that would be more evil, putting a stop to it right the way he did. It's violence. It says that over and over again in Scripture, but he loves justice. And while this is uncomfortable for us, he is seeing justice done. He is healing brokenness a little bit through brokenness here. But there's a reason why he has attacked that city. We also need to take note that God is with these people. In fact, God first talks about these people groups and the religious practices back in the time of Abraham. Genesis chapter 15, God made a promise to Abraham that, hey, one day this land is going to be yours, but you can't have it now because the sin of these peoples has not reached its full height. That God was going to be with them. He didn't wipe them out. They went through generations. They went through generations. They went through Isaac's generation. They went through Jacob's generation. They went through all the generations of the people when they lived in Israel. They went through Moses' generation, and now finally off there all this time, hundreds of years have gone by. God has allowed hundreds of these years for these people to repent, to turn away from their sinful practices, to turn toward him, or simply to stop their evil. And he has been patient long enough. At some point, it had to stop. Last thing I want to say about this is that God's desire is for all people to come to him. And these peoples, at any point, could come to him. In fact, we know that some of them did. Because, verse 22, but to the two men who had spied out the land, Joshua said, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring out from there the woman and all who belong to her, as you swore to her." So the young men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab and her father and brothers, all who belonged to her. And they brought all her relatives and put them outside the camp of Israel. And they burned with fire and everything in it, only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron, they put it into the treasury of the house of the Lord. But Rahab the prostitute and her father's house, all who belonged to her, Joshua saved alive. And she has lived in Israel to this very day, because she had messengers from Joshua who sent to spy out Jericho. And Joshua laid an oath on them at that and curses up and rebuilds the city Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn shall he lay its foundation, at the cost of the youngest son, gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was in all the land. God wanted to completely destroy, but anyone who would turn him was saved. Now, seeing this very unlikely person who back in Joshua saved these spies. When she saved them, she says that she believes that this God is the of heaven and of earth are her words. The God of heaven and of earth. She believes, and so she is saved. Again, I could talk about this for hours. And if you're looking for more resources that talk about this conquest, that talk about these accusations of genocide and what's happening here in this passage, we've actually put it on our website. You can go to the Pine Grove Church blog and click on that, and there's a couple articles and a video or two. I'll also put it, if you're in a community group, I'll put it in the community group blog, the CG blog as well. And if you have more questions, those are some additional views, additional resources to deal with this problem. But I want to keep talking about that because, again, the main thrust of this passage is not talking about that. It's talking about God doing the impossible for his people. And so that leads us with a question is, what are we to do with this information? What are we to do with a story like Joshua? And we are to learn to trust that God can do the impossible. We are to trust that God can do everything we ask. And as a perfect parent, no perfect parent gives their children everything they ask for. I feel like I share that example every other, but it's true, right? We're limited in our view. So, of course, God isn't going to do everything we ask for. We do not always know what is best, but he can do whatever he desires to change our lives and the world around us. If we will follow him and do things the way he has told us to do them, to live differently from the world around us, some of the more unusual path, we will see God do amazing things. Sometimes we'll be the ones who will have to be first to forgive. Sometimes we'll have to be the ones that go to prayer. Sometimes we'll have to be looked at and mocked at by the world around us. But at the end of the day, that is the pathway to God doing more than we could possibly imagine. You know, I think about flight and plane flight that we talked about when we started this morning. And I think about my experiences on a plane. I've flown dozens and dozens of times since I was little. My dad tried, we got some free tickets, and we'd probably do at least one flight a year as a family. And every time I'm on an airplane and the engines start roaring and we start flying down that runway and I see the trees going by me, there's always like a split second, but like, is this thing really going to take off? Like this plane is huge. This is not like the Wright brothers plane, all right? That's this little wooden, and I had a big lunch that's adding some weight to this plane, okay? Is this thing really going to take off? And all of a sudden, the tires lift up. And if you've been on a plane, you know the feeling where you're going, and then suddenly you're flying. We need to remember that God can do the impossible and that there's going to be moments where we're like, I got to get off this plane. But we understand the mechanics of how God works, that everything is possible, that a plane can lift off that weight. And to reminded to stay in our seats, to follow the Lord, because he can do more than we ask or imagine. All things are possible through him. Let's pray. Heavenly, if we need your help, Lord, our view of the world around us is limited. Lord, we have issues that we cannot resolve on our own. But you are with us, surviving and